Hello, everyone. It's Mat McLachlan here. Thank you for joining me once again. We did this last week on the Battle of Passchendaele, and it was really successful. We had a few hundred people tune in last week, and several thousand have watched it since. So thank you for joining us. And if you didn't see Passchendaele last week, go and check that out because it was quite popular. I've got people joining us already. Feel free to say hello. Where are you from? When you log on to watch, just post a comment telling us where you're from, because we want this, like last week, to be a two-way conversation. So if you've got plenty of questions to ask also about the bombing of Darwin, which we're discussing today, please add those as well. So, thank you. Lots of people joining us. That's great to see. It's going to be a good one. This was the Andrew King is joining us from Darwin. Andrew, maybe I should hand over to you. You probably know more about this than I do. But the bombing of Darwin is a topic that is very close to my heart. It's something I've been interested in for a long time. And I've been up there a lot to visit the sites, to walk the ground. It's a great spot. And this week was the anniversary of a pretty historic moment, combined with the fall of Singapore, which occurred in February. Pretty historic moment. So it's great to be able to talk about it now. So thank you for joining us. And as I said, please ask questions if you've got questions or comments about anything we're talking about here. It's going to be an interesting chat. Before we kick off, a few people have been asking me what I've been up to, and the answer is a lot. So I thought I would share a few things that have been going on in my world, because I'm so deeply involved in military history. It's something I absolutely love, and I'm very lucky that I get to do it in so many aspects of my life. So I wanted to share a few things I've been up to. Let's start with books. The first thing. So I've actually got two books in bookshops at the moment. The Cowra Breakout. So I hope you've read the Cowra Breakout. It came out last year, telling the story. Actually, we're going to talk a little bit about this today because there are some connections with the Cowra Breakout. So the story of the breakout of Japanese prisoners from the town of Cowra in 1944. That is currently in bookshops. I actually have two books in bookshops at the moment, which is great because Walking with the Anzacs. I gave away a copy of this last week, the updated version. So this is fully updated now. This was my book that came out in 2007 originally, all about the battlefields of the Western Front, and has been updated ever since. And this is the new version that I've done this year that's out in bookshops now as well. So I've got two books out in bookshops. Also, I've just submitted my manuscript for my next book, which is on the Battle of Krithia in Gallipoli. So that's my latest book, which is currently with the publishers. And in fact, I have to remind myself to do some edits on that book. I'll hopefully get that done next week, but that will be out in the middle of the year. So that's about the Battle of Krithia at Gallipoli, which is an unknown, a forgotten chapter, let's say, particularly for Australians, of the Gallipoli story. So it was great to tell that story. So look out for that in bookshops at the start of the year. What else is going on? Podcasts. There's three podcasts that I'm involved in. So my Living History podcast, which is always popular. So we're back for a new season now. That's a lot of interviews with interesting historians and walks around historic sites. Pete and Gary's Military History. If you're a fan of Pete and Gary's Military History, let me know in the comments, because lots of people are. Certainly check that one out. These are all available wherever you get your podcasts. Pete and Gary, that's Peter Hart and Gary Bain, two good mates of mine, and they do a fantastic podcast, quite a different take on military history out of the UK. So I see we've had a lot of new people joining. So feel free to say hello when you log on. So check out Pete and Gary's Military History. Also Battle Walks, which I know is a popular one, where Pete Smith, our fantastic historian, and Pete leads a lot of our tours for Mat McLachlan Battlefield Tours. In Battle Walks, we walk the ground in a virtual sense. We started doing it in COVID when we couldn't get out and actually walk the battlefields. And it's great that we've continued with Battle Walks basically now that we're out of, obviously, COVID. And that will be starting a new season very soon. So if you enjoy Battle Walks, look out for that one again. That's what's happening with podcasts. And if you want extra content either from everything we're doing, do subscribe. We'll put up a link. I'll use this technology now. There's a link. So this is our subscription address. And this basically everything we do, you get bonus content. So if we do a video, there will be a bonus video that goes along with that. Every episode of the podcast, there'll be bonus episodes that come out. You get everything ad-free. You get advanced access to all of our episodes, and you get exclusive live access to me and things like this that we're doing. So please do consider joining that team of subscribers, because we really value our subscribers. If you are a subscriber, thank you very much. Great to have you on board. in terms of touring, the main part of the business that we do, Battlefield 2, is very, very busy. Anzac Day is going to be super busy. So again, if you're watching this and you're heading to Anzac Day, thank you very much. It's going to be fantastic. People are coming back in a very big way to Battlefield touring, which is wonderful to see after the chaos of COVID. So it's great that everyone's back and are now completing those pilgrimages. It's a really wonderful thing to do. And in fact, we've just had a group come back from Darwin to be up there for the anniversary, the Battle of Darwin. So if you want to join us on a Battlefield tour, please visit our website and look at those great tours. We've got tours to Gallipoli, France, Darwin, and lots of other places around the world. So we'd love to see you on a tour. Getting out and walking the ground is what I love doing. So we hope to see you over there. With videos, we've been doing a lot of video documentary productions, actually. And the latest one came out only a couple of days ago, which was on walking London's hidden war sites from the First and Second World Wars. And this was a really great experience. I filmed it last year when I was spending some time over in the UK. And it's a really good one. There's a guy called Steve Honeysett who I'd invite you to look up. Blitzwalker is his name on social media and on the web, and absolutely look him up. And if you're going to London, contact Steve and do a walk around London and visit some of those sites. In fact, what I will do now is I'm going to show you a short clip from that video that we did walking around London, exploring hidden war sites. So obviously London's been rebuilt, but on every corner just about, there's a reminder of the First or Second World War. And Steve and I had a fantastic time. You can see that in the video for free on YouTube. So I'll put a link there where you can go and check that out. But do go and have a look at that video. But here is a short clip just to give you a taste of what Steve and I do walking around London.
Damage to the exterior of the church, Steve. I mean, I know we already said that the church was completely gutted during that last big attack of the first stage of the Blitz. But I tell you what, mate, there's nothing that brings it home like seeing that damage here. You can literally see where bombs have exploded and shards have sprayed. I mean, they call it splash or spray, and you can see why. It looks like water's been splashed across the side of the church. Just extraordinary. Extraordinary this is still here. Tell me about that raid and the effect that had on the church and on London.
Well, it was the night of the 10th, 11th of May, 1941. It proved to be the last raid of the Blitz. Londoners didn't know that at the time, but obviously Hitler was looking to attack the Soviet Union, and he needed his Luftwaffe resource to support that attack. It was also the heaviest raid of what we call the Night Blitz or the First Blitz. Quite small beer in comparison with the RAF and American raids on Germany later in the war, but by Blitz standards, it was significant. It was something in the region of 450 aircraft, dropped 1,400 tons of bombs, and probably, I think the figure quoted is about 3,500, 4,000 incendiary bombs. So a significant amount of bombs that were dropped. So again, it was the heaviest loss of life in a single raid during the Blitz. And one eyewitness at the time, who was a post office engineer working on repairing the telephone lines, he made the comment, he said, there was never a raid like it. He said, had there been another one, they'd have had us on our backs.
So you can watch that on YouTube for free. The full video goes for about an hour of Steve and I walking around, checking out those sites. So we do World War I sites and a lot of World War II sites. Incredible stuff. So it's great. Definitely check out Steve if you're in London. Let's get on to Darwin. From London to Darwin. We're a long way away from the bombing of Darwin, both in terms of the war and the destination. So let's talk about the bombing of Darwin. That's what we're going to do today. So the bombing of Darwin took place on the 19th of February, 1942. It was a pretty chaotic week for the world and Australia in particular, because Singapore had fallen on the 15th of February 1942. Pearl Harbor had only been 10 weeks earlier on the 7th of December 1941, and the Japanese had been marauding through Asia. So I've been doing a lot of interviews about this week and just trying to imagine what it must have been like to be in Darwin in 1942, to be in Australia, to think the threat of Japanese invasion was going to happen at any time. So let's talk this evening about the bombing of Darwin, what it was all about, and why it occurred and what it resulted in. So let's talk about that. I will share a map with you as well. So here's showing Darwin in relation to the world. So lots of Aussies will obviously know exactly where Darwin is. But hello, Michael. Thank you for tuning in from Melbourne. Nice to see you. Australians will know where Darwin is in the north of Australia, but if you're watching from the US or the UK, you may not know. So it's right up there in the top. It's right up there in the north of Australia. And as you can see, the important thing here, I don't know why that dot is showing me in Brisbane. I'm not in Brisbane, I'm in Sydney. But anyway, you can see exactly where Darwin is from that map right up in the north of Australia. And the important thing to note here is the two things in the top left and right there as well, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, because this really defines why Darwin was a target and why the Japanese attacked it. So the attack took place from aircraft on the 19th of February, 1942. There's a misunderstanding about this. A lot of people, both at the time and since, have thought that the attack on Darwin was all about an invasion of Australia, that this was the first step or the latest step in a Japanese invasion. And you can understand why that was the case, that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and then also were marauding down through Asia and capturing so much of Asia and the Pacific. Just, it seemed like they were unstoppable in those early months of 1942. The reason they attacked Darwin was because of what we can see in the top left in Indonesia. They were attacking these islands. So the tiny little island immediately to the northwest of Darwin is Timor, and a little bit further west is Java. And the Japanese were in the process of invading both Timor and Java. So they really were right on the doorstep of Australia. Darwin was a very big military port, basically. There was a lot of ships. It's got a very big harbour. There was a lot of ships. Something like 80 ships were in the harbour on the day of the attack. And there were 2 military airfields there as well. So Darwin was a very important forward air base. It had become a forward air base almost inadvertently at about this time, because prior to the war, Darwin's population was only about 5,000. It was really just a stopping off point on the way to Singapore and further north. But obviously the war arrived. It made sense with its airfields and its harbour to make it a forward base against the Japanese. But with the Japanese so close, again, as you can see on that map, as you can see, I'll blow that up even further. As you can see on that map, the islands just to the north there, Darwin was extremely close to Indonesia and New Guinea that the Japanese had desires to take. And so that was basically why. The reason the Japanese attacked was they were wanting to attack Indonesia, and they wanted to deny us the use of Darwin as a forward base to counterattack against them. It's a pretty straightforward military strategy when you think about it. If you're attacking ground and your enemy has a major base that they're going to use against you, knock it out of the picture. And it actually worked quite effectively. Darwin, it was difficult for Darwin to be used as a forward base after this attack. So the thing that's the most fascinating was we asked the question, who was it that attacked? Oh, here's another map of Darwin before we move on. Here's a map showing the city of Darwin in 42, 43, just to give you an idea of what it was like. So the big harbour and the city, oil plants off to the right, and a couple of airfields there as well. So the question is who attacked? Where did the Japanese attack come from? And here it is, aircraft carriers. But not just any aircraft carriers. These were 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, which is an incredible connection with Pearl Harbor. So the ships that attacked Pearl Harbor, the task force that attacked Pearl Harbor, then moved back to Japan, refitted, set themselves up again, and then came back and attacked Darwin only 10 weeks later. So these are the ships. So the 4 aircraft carriers were Akagi, Kagahiru, and Soru, 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They swung down and attacked Darwin. So let's talk a little bit about those ships, about the aircraft carriers, before we move on with actually the attack. So here's the 4. I will remove myself from the picture so you can see a bit more clearly, but here are the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that attacked Darwin. So they're the 4 just showing the different sizes. It's interesting in the story of the Japanese aircraft carriers, because I talk about this quite a bit in my book, The Cowra Breakout, just to set the scene for the attack on Darwin and the following events, is that Japan, after the First World War, there'd been a world treaty limiting the size of warships and trying to put a lid on future wars. And so Japan's aircraft carrier program was really quite an improvised program. They took other ships and ripped off top layers and put decks on them, and they took smaller aircraft carriers and made them bigger. And in the 1930s, there was a whole program of developing bigger aircraft carriers. And in fact, Japan had probably the largest aircraft carrier fleet at the start of the Second World War, even bigger than America's. They actually had as many carriers, or at one point they had more carriers than America. So Japan they recognized very early on the importance of air power, which would define future wars, they were very quick off the mark with that, and developed aircraft carriers with both fighters and bombers and torpedo bombers. So as we said, 6 of those participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, but then 4 of them, these 4, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Hiru, and the Soru, forgive my terrible Japanese pronunciation, then swung down to Australia and attacked Darwin in February 1942. Now, you will ask the question, I'm going to jump ahead in the story, spoiler alert here, what happened? What was the fate of these 4 aircraft carriers during the Second World War? Well, they were all lost in Midway in June 1942. March, April, May, June. 4 months later, they all were sunk or scuttled at the Battle of Midway. All 4. These were the 4 ships, coincidentally, the 4 ships that Japan lost at Midway, 4 aircraft carriers, these 4. So fascinating, that connection all the way through. So the connection with Pearl Harbor, the connection with Darwin, and then the connection with Midway. So all 4 of these ships were lost in Midway in June 1942. Quite extraordinary. So, yeah, aircraft carriers, really essential. There were 2 attacks on Darwin. The first was launched from aircraft carriers of 188 planes, all launched from carriers. This will give you an indication. This is a demonstration of Japanese planes lined up on the deck of an aircraft carrier. So you can see how tightly they were crammed in there. Imagine trying to take off. This is before the attack on Pearl Harbor, this photo, not the attack on Darwin, but it gives you an indication of what exactly was going on. And the same complement of planes effectively was used from each carrier for the attack on Darwin. So that gives you just an indication of what was going on and what it was like. Just another photo. This is the Cargo. This was one of the ships that attacked Darwin, just to show the island, as it was called, the Japanese, the control tower effectively on the carrier, which contained the bridge and all the operations areas. It's actually relatively small for the size of the carrier. The Japanese underestimated the importance of radar throughout the war. And so they didn't have the same radar facilities on their carriers that the Americans had. But also look at this in line. If you can see in the background there, look at the ships, the warships supporting the carriers. So the task force, it wasn't just the carriers out on their own. They had dozens and dozens of ships with them. I'm trying to remember how many ships were in the task force. Hundreds. There was a huge complement of ships. And a couple of Japanese pilots who were obviously the key to any of these attacks were the men who flew them. We're going to talk very specifically in a moment about one of the pilots because it's a fascinating story. So let's talk about the attack on Darwin. It was a pretty straightforward plan. Darwin was poorly defended, particularly with fighters and with anti-aircraft defenses. So there were 2 waves of the attack on the 19th of February. Let me say that Darwin was completely unprepared for this. No one expected the Japanese to launch an attack. There was a huge failure of intelligence. There was a suspicion that Darwin was protected because they felt that it was a good target, but it was very badly prepared for an attack. There was only a handful of fighters there to defend. They were mostly piloted by Americans. Some anti-aircraft defenses, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But it was, Darwin was very poorly prepared. And so there were 2 waves in the attack on Darwin. So the first, planes took off from the aircraft carriers and they flew over Bathurst Island and over Melville Island. And they arrived at Darwin at 9:58 in the morning. So let's have a look. There's a good map here, which I'm going to show you now, which shows what we're talking about with Darwin. So there's a lot going on here. So this was Darwin before the attack. And this is from an excellent book, which sadly I forgot the name, The Bombing of Darwin, I think it was called. But I've got these online. So these are not diagrams I created, but I've borrowed them to show you. But it's a fantastic book. I'll put a link to it because it's absolutely fantastic. These maps are brilliant. So it shows the layout of Darwin. So you can see in the harbour there, lots of ships in the harbour. You can see the airfields up above, the RAAF airfield, and all this, also the civilian airfield. So 2 airfields there, a scattering of anti-aircraft batteries, but not too many. And this shows how Darwin was set up before the attack. And then this is a good indication that the Japanese, so this shows 3 aircraft. There are actually 188 aircraft in the first wave, both fighters and bombers. So it shows they flew over Bathurst and Melville Islands. They were spotted from Melville Island, and Melville Island plays an important role in the story that I'm going to tell shortly. And the Japanese did something pretty clever. They flew in, they overflew to the east of Darwin, and then swung around and attacked from the south, which means they came in across the harbour. They attacked the ships in the harbour. They attacked the port facilities. They attacked the oil storage facilities in Darwin. They also attacked the town but that may have been inadvertent. Most famously, the post office was destroyed and a number of civilians were killed in the post office. There was no reason for them to attack buildings in the port town of Darwin. So it may have been simply that they were aiming for the oil storage facilities and missed their target. But some parts of the city were badly damaged, including most famously the post office, which was destroyed. And sadly, a number of civilians lost their lives, including the family that ran the post office. So that was a very sad tale. So this was the attack. It was over in a matter of minutes. They swooped in and attacked. And in a matter of minutes, Darwin was on fire. And let me talk about... I want to give you a couple of quotes here about the bombing of Darwin. And this comes from a bloke called Jack Mulholland, who was 19 in 1940. He was 21 at the time of the bombing of Darwin. And he was on an anti-aircraft gun. And his account, look out for it, his book. So Jack Mulholland wrote his memoirs about the time, and it was just incredible, his accounts. And here's his account of what he looked at as he looked from his anti-aircraft battery. The harbour was a storm of water rising like geysers, and a good area of it was covered with burning oil. Ships were at anchor and could not or did not have time to take evasive action. Many ships were being hit by the dive bombers, causing columns of smoke to rise in the air. Just horrific what was going on in Darwin at the time as these planes were coming in. And this is describing... I'll read this quote from Jack as well, describing what he was up to in the gun pit. The gun pit was a frenzy of half-naked, sweaty bodies doing what they had been trained to do. Fire was called by the number 1, and number 5 forced the firing lever to the rear. The whole gun seemed to jump, with the long barrel recoiling and the spent case being extracted to the rear. Those who were at the rear of the gun did a soft shoe shuffle as they dodged the hot, empty cases, then picked them up and hurled them over the top of the revetment. The pit was hotter than usual, the air foul with the fumes of burnt explosives, dust and smoke. The whole dominated by the thunderous roar of gunfire and exploding bombs. So, and Jack and his team managed to actually shoot down a bomber as it came in, a dive bomber as it came in. But that was a rare occurrence. The Japanese were pretty well unhindered in their attack on Darwin because of just the lack of defenses. And this is a really good example of this. You can see here the results of Japanese attacks on the number of planes. So the 5 American Kitty Hawks were in Darwin, coincidentally, at the time, and they were circling over Darwin at the time of the attack. So number 1 shows a representation of the planes flying over Darwin. 2 shows the Japanese aircraft coming in. One of the Kitty Hawks realised that he was in big trouble and flew south to safety and landed in Catherine, in the middle of Northern Territory. One of the Kitty Hawks was badly shot up by Zeros, but managed to crash land at the airport. 5 was a Kitty Hawk pilot who bailed out of his stricken aircraft, and 6 and 7 show Kitty Hawks that were shot down and their pilots killed. So I was reading an account doing research for this, and one Japanese pilot got lost when he took off from his carrier and got lost and arrived before the attack. He actually arrived before the attack wave and was immediately set upon by 5 Kitty Hawks and shot down 4 of them. So it just shows that the huge superiority the Japanese Zero had at the time, this early in the war. There was a bit of mysticism about the Zero and its abilities in combat, and this just goes to show the supremacy that the Zero had at the time. American and Allied planes caught up in the later stages of the war, but at this stage, the Zero was all conquering. And I'm sure you've all seen the absolutely horrific photos of Darwin burning after the attack. So the ships sunk in the harbour. 11 ships were sunk or damaged. The harbour was set on fire. This shows the oil storage tanks on fire, and lots of the town was destroyed. And that was the attack at about 10 a.m., just before 10 a.m. And then everyone was going about their business, picking up rubble and trying to clear up everything a little bit. And then just before midday, so 2 hours after the first attack at 11:58 a.m., a second attack occurred, a second raid. And these were high-altitude bombers who came in from bases in Ambon and other parts of Indonesia. So 54 planes. So 188 in the first wave and 54 bombers in the second wave. And they weren't even accompanied by fighters. That shows how inadequate the defenses were. They just came in, these slow twin-engine bombers, Bettys and Nells, and bombed basically the hell out of the airfields. They targeted the airfields specifically and caused a huge amount of damage on the airfields. And again, more destruction in the town, more death and mayhem. And this just shows some of the damage to Darwin. You can see the buildings are fairly flimsy. They were designed to stand up to cyclones and tropical weather, but not bombs. So the town was quite unprepared, and there was devastation caused by those 2 raids. So 188 planes in the first raid from the aircraft carriers, 54 from land bases in the second. So, yeah, quite a disaster for the town of Darwin. Black Tiger, my grandfather was an artilleryman in Darwin during World War II, watching from Queensland, Australia. Well, he would have had a front row seat at the time, Black Tiger. And yeah, the harrowing descriptions of people who were there in Darwin. And of course, a lot of people left after the bombing, both military and civilian left, just because they felt that Darwin was terribly exposed. Andrew King, the US called them war hawks and the Commonwealth nations called them kitty hawks. Thank you, Andrew. Interesting information. So that was the bombing of Darwin. The attacks, it was all over pretty quickly. The planes flew in, they knocked the hell out of Darwin, and then disappeared just as quickly as they'd been there. And so it was a pretty ferocious attack. It caught the people of Darwin off guard. What to say about it? There was a lot of controversy about what had happened in the attacks. There's arguments even still today about how many people died. The general figure is around 250 people were killed, both military and civilian. There was a lot of confusion as well in the military ranks because no one really knew what was going on. We've got to understand the threat of invasion was imminent. People felt like they were right on the front line, and if the Japanese were attacking, they must be about to land troops. On one of the Air Force bases, there was confusion. Some of the flyers were ordered to, and some of the airmen were ordered to pull back from the airfield and reassemble at assembly points further away. There was confusion about where those points were, and so some of the Air Force personnel just hit the road and kept going, basically. I don't think we should paint them in too bad a light this far after the fact. It was chaos and unclear instructions. But a lot of the military personnel and, of course, the civilians left the town. So probably half the civilian population had either moved out before the attack or moved out in response to the attack. So 2,500 of the 5,000 odd civilians that were there. Probably 250 people killed. And so there are comparisons with Pearl Harbor, and there's a quote that goes around that more tonnage of bombs was dropped on Darwin than was dropped on Pearl Harbor. That's correct, but it's a bit of a technicality. About 3,500 people were killed at Pearl Harbor compared to 250 odd in Darwin. And so the main difference there was the Japanese didn't use torpedoes at Darwin, and they used bombs. They used bombs exclusively. So technically, yes, more tonnage of bombs was dropped, but the damage from Pearl Harbor was greater than Darwin, but it was still a horrific attack. This was by far the largest attack, the first and largest attack launched on Australia during the Second World War. And the civilians and the military people that were killed, not just during the attack, but during wartime in Darwin, are all buried here at Adelaide River Cemetery. And if you go up to Darwin, there's some wonderful World War II sites to see, but the key to them is this cemetery, Adelaide River Cemetery, a little bit out of Darwin, an hour or so down the road. Just an extraordinary place to see all the people that were killed there during the raid and also afterwards in several other attacks that occurred on Darwin, and also in other military operations just in and around Darwin during the war. So it's wonderful to see a Commonwealth cemetery. If you've been to the Western Front or Gallipoli, you recognise the Cross of Sacrifice. It's wonderful to see it in Australia, commemorating all those brave people who died during the war in and around Darwin. So it's quite an extraordinary place. So definitely go there when you head up to Darwin. I want to talk about this man. I want to talk about specific characters, and this is someone who featured fairly prominently in my book, The Kara Breakout. Hajime Toyoshima was a Zero pilot, and this is a absolutely fantastic story. Toyoshima was a Zero pilot who flew off Hiru, one of those carriers I talked about. Every bit of information that talks about Toyoshima as a Zero pilot says that this was his first operation. But during my research for the Kara Breakout, I actually discovered that wasn't the case. This was not his first operation at all. He'd actually been at Pearl Harbor. He didn't fly in the attack on Pearl Harbor, but his aircraft took off during the Pearl Harbor attack, and he flew combat air patrol over the carrier fleet. So combat air patrol basically means defensive flying. So he wasn't attacking Pearl Harbor. He was defending the carriers in case they were discovered by American forces. He would have had to fight off any fighters or bombers that came to attack the carrier fleet. He didn't have much to do on the day, of course, because no American planes came anywhere near the carrier fleet at Pearl Harbor. But he then participated in a couple of other operations in the lead up to in the lead up to Darwin, perhaps Wake, and a couple of other operations that the fleet participated in, and where he may or may not have achieved some kills in his fighter. But at Darwin, he flew off the Hiru, the carrier. He flew over Bathurst Island and Melville Island. His job was to shoot down any fighters that appeared, but as we said before, there weren't many fighters to shoot down. And so Toyoshima sort of flew around. He probably strafed the harbour because we know that his guns were half empty. I'll tell you why in a minute. We know that, but he didn't have much to shoot at, so he probably flew around, provided protection for the bombers, strafed the harbour a little bit, and then started to fly back to his carrier. But he had come under some anti-aircraft fire from machine guns, just 303 machine guns on the ground. Some reports say from a man with a 303 rifle, but that's certainly not the case. It was machine guns on the ground, probably Lewis guns firing in anti-aircraft defence. And one lucky shot actually pierced his engine and damaged the fuel of the oil line for his engine. And he actually, halfway back to the carrier, realized that his plane was not performing and had to crash. And he crashed on Melville Island, just north of Darwin. And this shows the wreckage of his Zero. So he did a belly landing on Melville Island, which was his decision not to bail out. His decision was to crash land the plane. Probably a mistake from his point of view, because had he bailed out of the plane would have crashed into the ocean. As it was, he belly landed on Melville Island, and his plane, apart from some damage to the wings from hitting small trees, was virtually undamaged. And so this was the first Japanese Zero to fall intact, to fall into Allied hands. So a couple of Zeros had been shot down at Pearl Harbor, but they had crashed and were too badly deformed to be of much use. This one was almost virtually intact. So it was a huge win for the Allies. So it was actually a mistake for Toyoshima to crash land on Melville Island. He should have probably tried to destroy his plane. He should have bailed out and crashed the plane so it wouldn't fall into Allied hands. But this was quite a coup. Michael's got a question here for us. Were they alert for an invasion straight after the bombing? Absolutely. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail about the state of affairs in 1942 in response to the bombing. But they were absolutely alert to an invasion immediately after the bombing. Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about that shortly. So this shows Toyoshima's plane crashed on Melville Island, just north of Darwin. And Toyoshima, it's a hell of a story. He was captured by Aboriginal people who took him into custody. And one report says that the man that took him in pressed a tomahawk into his back or a spear into his back and pretended he had a rifle, and so rounded him up and took him off to a nearby Air Force base on the adjoining island, Bathurst Island. And this shows Toyoshima banged up. His face hit the instrument panel when he crash landed. And this shows him with a guy called Les Powell, a young Australian Air Force member of the RAAF, who took custody of Toyoshima from the indigenous people who had captured him. And this shows Les Powell holding Toyoshima's pistol. And interestingly, the indigenous people had forced Toyoshima to strip out of his flight suit, which is why he's in his underwear with his face all bandaged from hitting the instrument panel. He's an interesting character, Toyoshima, a fascinating character. He was with the Australian airmen on the base on Bathurst Island for a few days before he was picked up by authorities. And whilst there, he was quite chatty. He spoke to them. They're all Air Force people, even though they're on opposite sides. Well, he was technically a Navy man, but he was a flyer, so they had a lot in common. And he started picking up rudimentary English while he was chatting with the Australians in the few days he was on Bathurst Island. And for all accounts, even though in all these pictures he appears quite fearsome, from all accounts he was very likable. He had a great personality, and everyone, both Japanese and Australian, that came across him over the next several years reported on how much they liked him, what a charming personality he had, that he was very intelligent, and he started to pick up English. He didn't speak a word of English when he crashed, but he started to pick up English. And of course, he was Australia's first Japanese prisoner of the Second World War. This is him here, and he went on to have quite a remarkable story, which ended, sadly, in 1944 with him participating or being one of the instigators of the Kara breakout, the prisoner of war breakout that I wrote the book about. And so Toyoshima was one of the instigators of that. He blew the bugle that announced the start of the attack. That was the signal for the attack. That bugle is in the collection of the Australian War Memorial, and I had the honour of holding it in my hands. It's quite an extraordinary link with history. So that was Toyoshima's bugle that he blew to signal the start of the breakout. And this dreadful photo shows blankets thrown over the wire of the prison camp and a Japanese dead body lying there in the foreground. So Kara breakout, 230 odd Japanese were killed and 5 Australians were killed on the night of the 5th of August, 1944. So horrific breakout, and a very strong link with Darwin, with Pearl Harbor and Darwin, because of Toyoshima, the Zero fighter pilot who kicked the whole thing off. So Toyoshima is a fascinating story, a very strong link with Darwin. They tell his story quite well up in the museums in Darwin, and there's a very strong link there with Toyoshima. He never revealed that he was a Zero pilot, and no one ever figured it out. He told them that he was a sort of a lonely a lonely airman on a bomber. He said he was a crewman on a bomber, not a Zero pilot. And so the Allies never realised the glittering prize they had in their hands, which was a Zero fighter pilot, which is really quite extraordinary because they found a crashed fighter plane, as I showed you the photo before. They found this wreck on Melville Island, and they found a Japanese pilot wandering around in the bush, but didn't put two and two together that he was the Zero fighter pilot. So that would have been an intelligence coup. But having the plane was an intelligence coup, and it was quickly broken down and sent to all parts of basically the Allied forces. The Americans were very interested to see it. The British wanted to see it as well, so that everyone could work out what they were up against, and the Australians. And that plane, the remains of that plane that came out of the jungle are in Darwin still. So absolutely essential to see if you go up there. It's in the Aviation Museum, which is a fantastic museum to check out. That plane is very easy to overlook. It's just obviously it's a wreck just in the corner of the museum. I didn't realize it was there when I went up, and I was writing this book about the Carabreaker. So I went up and just stumbled across it. Incredible to see. That's the plane, the wreck that we saw here. Not that one. That one. The wreck that we saw of that plane is now in Darwin, permanently on display. Really quite extraordinary. So if you go to Darwin, add that to your list as well to see the wreck of Toyishima's plane and the connection with Pearl Harbor, Darwin bombing, and the Kara breakout. Just an extraordinary story. So thank you for indulging me with that story. I always love telling the story of Toyishima. It's a very personal story for me, and it's a great tale to tell. Something I want to talk about with the bombing of Darwin, the cover-up. We all talk about this. I'm sure everyone has heard about this, the cover-up that the authorities didn't want anyone to know because they didn't want to panic. And up in Darwin, I was doing some interviews up there. I was doing radio interviews with the people of Darwin, and they were talking about the great cover-up and the lies that were told to cover up the bombing of Darwin. So let's talk about the huge cover-up that took place to hide the truth of the bombing of Darwin from the Australian population. Starting with this is the Argus, one of the most read newspapers in Australia, published in Melbourne. This is the day after the bombing. And of course, if you're going to cover something up, what better way to do it than to put it in the national newspaper? So my rather sarcastic point is there was no cover-up of the bombing of Darwin. This is the day after the attack. Darwin heavily bombed in 2 raids. One thing that was covered up somewhat is that the government didn't release information about how bad the damage had been. So this article says that it was only 93 planes, when in effect it was about 235 planes. 4 were shot down. That is true. They did shoot down a couple of planes. Damage considerable, but casualties unknown. They didn't have an exact number of the casualties at this stage, but they were getting some indication that a lot of people had been killed and that Darwin was in ruins and that they'd lost a lot of ships in the harbour as well. So that was covered up. But that just made sense. Why would they have given a propaganda coup to the Japanese by putting in the papers that Japan had basically caught us napping and had inflicted a pretty terrible blow on us? So yes, it is true that the extent of the damage was kept under the government's hat somewhat, but not the knowledge of the raid. So I think in the post-war years and the decades since, there's kind of been this idea that the government, that no one knew that Darwin had been attacked in Australia and had been covered up, and that there was a risk of invasion, and that the Australian people weren't adequately informed. That certainly isn't the case. There were a lot of people in Darwin. There were thousands of people in Darwin who suffered the effects of the raid, of the attacks, and they certainly told people about it, told friends and family, and the word spread pretty quickly. So the day after, all the papers in Australia, when I was researching this, I was looking up and it was difficult to pick one paper to use as the example because every paper in Australia ran a story about the bombing of Darwin. The Prime Minister released a statement. It was news all over the country the day of the bombing, the day after the bombing. So it was played down. The effects were played down so as not to cause a panic and so as not to give a propaganda win to the Japanese, and for military secrecy, of course. They didn't want to reveal exactly what was going on. But it's not true that no one knew about the bombing and that it was covered up. Let's talk a little bit more about 1942 in general, because there's some misunderstandings as it relates to what was going on in Australia in 1942, and it's worth discussing them because it's quite a fascinating part of the story. What was going on in Australia in 1942? The first thing I will say is that people in the start of 1942 were quite justifiably terrified of a Japanese invasion. Just look at the 3 big things that had occurred. Not just 3, but even if we just look at 3. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 1941, the fall of Singapore on the 15th of February, and then the attack on Darwin on the 19th of February. You can imagine that there was just absolute terror that the Japanese were going to land in Australia. And it just made sense. They were attacking Timor. We saw in that opening slide how close Timor is to Australia. I'll bring that back up again so we can see exactly how close. That opening map. That tiny little island, top left of the red Darwin indicator, that's Timor. And that's as close as the Japanese were. They were also obviously planning to land in New Guinea, although that hadn't started in February 1942. But they were landing in Timor. Australians were justifiably terrified that an attack was coming, including the government. They felt that it was fairly likely there would be an attack on Australia, an invasion of Australia. And the government called for vigilance at the time. Here's where it gets interesting, though. I mean, other things occurred as well. May 1942, we had the attack on Sydney with the midget submarines and other attacks around. And in fact, I'll show that now. It's not a very good graphic, forgive me for that, but this gives an indication of what was going on in Australia at the time. This is 1942, 1943, exactly what was going on. So just to break it down, every red dot in the north there indicates a Japanese attack on a land target in Australia. So there were more than 100 Japanese attacks between 1942 and 1943 in the north of Australia. We don't quite realize that. And the big stars indicate sites so that were hit more than once. So we're talking Townsville, Horn Island, several sites up in the Northern Territory, the hardest hit of which was Darwin. Broome was hit famously several times. Lots of civilians were killed. Learmonth in Western Australia. Darwin was hit something like 68 times, I think was the number. A huge number of times Darwin was hit. Just quite extraordinary. So we can see the breadth of the attack, so we can see why there was a great fear of an invasion, and then have a look down the east coast and the south coast, ships that were sunk, ships that were attacked. The red ship icons there show Japanese submarines, the attack on Sydney Harbour, Newcastle was shelled. There was a lot of activity between Victoria and Tasmania and Bass Strait down there. There were submarines and ships, and German raiders were also coming in as well. Don't forget, 1941, we had the Cormoran sinking the Sydney. There was a lot of activity. Australia felt very exposed. The interesting thing about that, as I said, people can be forgiven for thinking that there was an imminent invasion coming. I'm going to say something now, and this is, in my experience, this is one of the two most controversial things I can ever say in military history. About the middle of 1942, because we were intercepting Japanese signals and because our talented code breakers had broken Japanese codes, both in Australia and America, we were effectively reading the Japanese mail, and we discovered that the Japanese were quite specific that there were no plans to invade Australia. This is an inarguable fact. The Japanese actually told us, or didn't tell us, they were telling each other. The whole story was that in the early part of 1942, given Japanese success, some mid-ranking naval officers had suggested that the next step should be an invasion of Australia, should be the next step. It was completely dismissed by all the powers that be. The army people actually called it gibberish. That was their word to describe, obviously the Japanese word, but the English translation is gibberish, the plans to invade Australia. The Navy said we did not have anywhere near a number of ships. Even the Navy commanders, even though it had been a naval suggestion, the Navy commanders said, we don't have the resources to do this. The Army said, we absolutely don't have the resources to do this. And so it was dismissed pretty quickly. And interestingly, by the middle of 1942, by reading Japanese transmissions and communications, we had a very clear understanding that the Japanese plan was not to invade Australia. The Japanese plan was to capture Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Fiji, New Caledonia, a ring of islands in the Pacific, and isolate Australia from America, which obviously still would have been disastrous for Australia, but it's not the same as Japanese troops landing and fighting their way across the continent. So we also know this now from looking at Japanese records in the decades since the war, so that there was no plan from Japan to invade Australia. So that is the reality. However, it wasn't quite what was put to the Australian people. It's a fascinating aspect of our World War II history when we look at this in this way. That these are a couple of posters that you'd be familiar with. That He's Coming South was a big propaganda campaign. I mean, look at that depiction of that Japanese soldier. I mean, that is terrifying. I mean, children would have run screaming from a poster like that. Safety demands obedience. The word now is must. That other poster there, I mean, it's an ad for Beaufort's. Ringed with menace. I mean, look at everything happening there around Australia, Japanese submarines and troops in the north. And, it just looks like at any moment, Australia is going to be invaded. This is just the way it was portrayed. bar the gates with Beaufords is an indicator of why this was something that the government was not keen to shy away from, because they want people to invest in war bonds, which could then be used to build aircraft to defend Australia. So the government, the government benefited somewhat by trying to protect Australia. In their efforts to protect Australia, it was beneficial for the government, for people to believe that a threat was imminent of an invasion, because it was just a clear message. It was a very clear message they could give to the Australian people. Look at that poster there. He's coming south. You can't get clearer than that. The suggestion that the Japanese were about to invade was something the government did not shy away from. And it's quite controversial. I think it's something that should be more discussed, that if the government, particularly in 1943, knew that the Japanese weren't going to invade, why were they still telling people that they were? So it's controversial, that decision, but that opinion. But we now know that. So it's something that should be more talked about, the actual threat of invasion. But probably to the people of 1942, it didn't make much difference whether there were going to be Japanese troops in the street or not, because they were coming under attack. And it was terrifying. And here's two of the things that are most commonly rolled out to talk about the invasion. The map there is a hand-drawn map showing this defensive line across the middle of Australia. The Brisbane line, it's sometimes referred to, even though the Brisbane line supposedly came down the east coast. This one's showing the southern half of Australia being defended and the north not being defended. So this is the story of the Brisbane line. The suggestion that was made during the war and that carries on to today was that the Defence Forces were going to pull back to the east of Australia and defend a line that stretched from Brisbane to Melbourne and abandon the rest of Australia. It was put forward as a suggestion that if there was a Japanese invasion, this is something we should do, but it was never adopted as a formal plan. And basically, it was used by the opposition, particularly members of the opposition who came from anywhere west of that line. It was used by the opposition as a fantastic fuel to target the government, to say that the government's planning to abandon most of Australia. General MacArthur, for some reason, didn't do us any favours. He mentioned it as well, that he'd heard that Australia was going to be, the east coast of Australia was going to be defended. The rest was going to be abandoned. It's just not true. It was never a policy. It was maybe a suggestion in a paper at some stage in 1942, but it was never, the Brisbane line was never a formal plan that the Australians adopted. The other one that I've got in that picture there is the Japanese invasion currency that we sort of hear about all the time, that the Japanese had started printing Australian money as a precursor to invasion. They did print currency, which was in Australian currency, £1, one Australian pound, but it was for Australian protectorates and territories they'd already captured, most notably New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, those areas, New Britain as well. So the Japanese had a bit of a problem with all the territory they'd captured. Is how are they going to run government and currency and things like that? And so they just adopted a system of using the local currency, their own version of the local currency. It was the easiest thing to do. So the Japanese government, one Australian pound, which would be distributed in the Solomon Islands or New Guinea. You can see there's palm trees. It doesn't look very Australian. It's obviously a Pacific island. There was a real issue with the Japanese invasion currency, was that after the war, after the Japanese were kicked out, they'd paid for all these things to local people with this currency that was now completely worthless. It was just monopoly money by the time the Japanese were kicked out. And so local people suffered very badly because they'd been paid for several years in currency that was now completely worthless. So it's still a fascinating story, but it's a little bit misunderstood in Australia. And when you think about it, if Japan was planning to invade Australia, if you thought about the thousands of ships, the millions of troops that would be required, the aircraft, everything that they needed, pretty low on their priority list would be printing currency. But anyway, again, really interesting part of the history, a little bit misunderstood. Doesn't make the story any less interesting, doesn't make it less relevant. It doesn't make the fighting and the sacrifice that Australians did any less important to stop the Japanese. It was obviously essential, but a couple of specific things where how we remember 1942 get a little bit mixed up, shall we say. So yeah, so feel free to, I always get a lot of comments when I talk about this thing. As I said, it's one of the two probably most controversial things I ever say in military history. But it's important we keep asking these questions about what was going on at the time. So that's the Japanese attack on Darwin. The situation in 1942. What a terrible time! I say this so many times that it just must have been absolutely horrific to be in Australia in 1942. What would it be like? The shells landing on Newcastle, submarines in Sydney Harbour, planes bombing Darwin, Singapore having fallen, 15,000 Australian troops were captured in Singapore, and half of those would die in Japanese captivity. Just what a horrific year. The most terrifying, probably the most challenging year Australia has ever faced as a nation. And it brought about something really important in a foreign policy perspective, is that Australia felt very isolated and very alone. And of course, we had a lot of troops fighting in Europe, in North Africa and in Europe. And we wanted to bring those troops home to defend Australia. And Britain was very reluctant. Winston Churchill was very reluctant to hand those troops over. And so we started to realise in 1942, the bombing of Darwin was a key part of this, that we couldn't rely on Britain in the way that we hoped to. And to be honest, it didn't make a lot of sense for Australia to think of itself as a far-flung outpost of Europe, which is probably what we'd done up until that point. And it started to bring about a change in foreign policy, which started to direct us much more towards a more likely partner, and a partner that shared a lot more of our priorities in Asia Pacific, which of course was America. So 1942 forged that very strong relationship with America. America sent troops to garrison Australia. MacArthur was based in Brisbane for a very long time. There were millions of American troops came through Australia during the war. And from a foreign policy perspective, we forged a relationship with America that remains to this day. And it's not a one-way street. I mean, obviously, we're a small country and America is very important to us, but Australia is also vitally important to America in this region. It's really important for world peace and security that there is a thriving democracy in this part of the world, which is Australia, that shares the same Western values with America. So I won't get into the politics. Obviously, we're going too far down a rabbit hole, but this relationship we have with America that has continued to today was forged in the fires of 1942. So it's a really important time. And the bombing of Darwin was the thing that really kicked that off and made Australia make these tough decisions and change its focus. So that's my story about the bombing of Darwin. I hope there's been some interesting aspects there. I'm going to show you a video like I did last week with Passionel. I'm going to show you a video about some of the things you can still see in Darwin. Let's show some of that. One of the things that they do really well in Darwin with the military history is the museums that are up there. There's the Aviation Museum I spoke about earlier, which has some fantastic aircraft done in a way that I like in a museum. There's great displays done up there. But also the Darwin Military Museum is something really quite special. So I thought I'd show you. A few years ago, I went up there and visited Darwin and saw all the sites. And this is a video that we will end on showing what you can still see up there at this incredible military museum. So I will play this video now. There's a wonderful chap called Norm Cramp who showed me all around up there. He's a great bloke, and hopefully you'll run into him when you're up there exploring Darwin's military history. But I'll show you this video and then I'll come back for a farewell. So I will see you soon.
I mean, I love what you've done here, the combination of incredible historic artifacts, technology. I mean, it just really brings this story to life. I mean, tell me about the vision for the museum and what you've done here to help tell the story of the bombing of Darwin.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Matt. Firstly, we're trying to educate people about not only the Northern Territory's rich military history, but about Australia's history in military conflict. The whole focus of this museum, which is 50 years old, last year, by the way, it's not celebrating war, it's trying to tell the story. But it not only tells the military story, it starts telling the civilian story as well. And that's a large part of our history, I think, that's been, to a degree, overlooked. And we need to focus on that because the civilians played a vital part in the recovery. And, you know, their lives were shattered. Quite a number of them lost their lives, but their homes were destroyed. Their livelihoods were lost, their friends and family were killed.
Norm, there's a perception that the story of the bombing of Darwin has been a little bit forgotten in Australia and indeed around the world. Why is it important that we tell this story? Why is it important that this story doesn't disappear from the pages of history?
Certainly you can understand that immediately after the initial raids in 1942, the Commonwealth government closed the place down. There was censorship, there was secrecy. They wanted to avoid panic. The fear of invasion was on everybody's mind. The Commonwealth government introduced martial law up here till about 1946. The local newspaper was closed down. The Army ran and published its own newspaper called Army News. It was, we've got quite a number of copies of the various editions, and it really is the propaganda type stuff that all's well and sort of, you know, everybody's doing fine, the war's going okay. So I think all of us can understand that, that censorship, but after the war, it was like the Commonwealth just walked away from it. Personally, I think there was a lot of embarrassment. We were caught totally unaware, unprepared. The promises of defending the North from 1911 up until 1942 hadn't come to fruition. And I think the majority of people in Australia wanted to forget it. And that little place, Darwin, well, so it got bombed once or twice. The story never got out. And what we're trying to do now is to say, this is a really important part of our national, not only military history, our national history. This is the most bombed, most attacked place in Australia.
So that was Norm Cramp at the Military Museum in Darwin, a great place to visit. It's absolutely fascinating. So I strongly encourage you to go up to Darwin, not just for the military history, as Andrew pointed out, but also for the for all the great history and the great sites to see out there. It's a fantastic place. I'd move to Darwin in a heartbeat if I could. It's a brilliant place. I love heading up there. That's it. That's the story of the bombing of Darwin. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed this live. A great opportunity to connect with you all. So thank you very much for tuning in. We're going to do one of these a week, so tune in every Thursday. We're going to do more of these as we go forward. It's just a great way to share these chapters of history and connect directly with you all. So thank you for tuning in. If you're watching this later on, it'll be up on YouTube recorded. So if you're watching this later on, please leave your questions in the comments and I'll get to those and come back to you. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you at the next live event.